Welcome back to another edition. Wanted to talk about something that I've talked a lot about in the various workshops and in my course at GGU, but I don't think I've ever done a podcast on this. And it has to do when you are say going to a consultant, any type of advisor, attorney, anybody that is a professional in their field where you may need some assistance in. And this is also true if you are one of these people, especially if you're in the business of giving advice. So I think I've talked about the stages of change before, that typically we're in one of 6 stages of change, which can be pre-contemplation. It's kind of like denial. I don't even know there is a problem. Contemplation, when some intervention maybe has happened and you start considering that maybe you ought to change or do something or take a certain action. Then the next stage is getting ready for the change. The 4th stage is actually changing, going into action. And that's the stage that we're most have the highest probability of changing, of accepting advice. And then the stage after that is relapse, where typically changes just don't happen one and done. It's a very normal process to go through relapse and then pick yourself up and continue on the path. And the 6th and final stage, Petraska in their book calls it termination, which I think can be a little abrupt, but it just means you got it. You've changed. This is part of your new behavior. So what I have said often, and I originally learned of this whole technique from Dr. Ted Klontz. And he would often say, when you meet resistance, you're moving too fast. So this is something I really try to ingrain in, certainly when I'm working with a client, whether it would be financial planning client or financial therapy client. It's also something that I try to pay attention to within myself, because the flip side of all this is true. When I feel resistant to someone's advice, I need to slow up. That person may be moving too fast, and oftentimes that person won't recognize it because they haven't been taught these particular skills. And so I need to do that for myself. Financial planners, some financial therapists, not all, and I would say not all planners, have this illusion that people come to them for financial advice. Okay, I think I probably have your attention now, especially if you're in the advice-giving business. Oftentimes, financial planners assume that their job is to give advice, and when they give the advice, especially advice that's an obvious solution to a to a problem, that clients are going to accept that, take it, go into action on it, and hopefully profusely thank the planner for their wonderful wisdom and insight. Now that does happen, and it happens maybe in about 20% of the cases. I don't have any data for that or research, where a person is in that action phase of the stages of change, or even on the planning to go into action. But in that stage, especially if the planner has, or if the client has come to the planner and wants to understand more about doing a budget, and the planner starts giving advice in that area, and that's exactly what the client wanted, because that's often what they came for. However, a person can say, well, I've come for this type of advice, and get that advice, and then get a lot of resistance and don't do it. That simply means they weren't really ready to change. And there's a lot of reasons that are behind that. So it's just kind of magical thinking for an advisor to think that somebody is going to welcome their advice. And it can be very confusing to the advice giver when providing the solution to their problem is met with resistance rather than acceptance. Now, typically, when we're hitting resistance, it can come in all sorts of forms. The one thing that is missing is going into action. So if the client doesn't do or take the advice that was given, that's a good sign of resistance. Clients could interrupt the planner. They could argue. You could list all the reasons that this solution is not right. And other clients will appear to agree with all the recommendations, but again, they are not going into action. There's a number of reasons why someone may not take advice that is given to them. Probably, I think one of the biggest reasons is that they weren't asked permission to get advice. I think one of the most important things that I have learned from therapists in observing and watching them, being clients of them, is they will more times than not ask if the client would like advice. The first time I came into that concept, it just kind of, it was unfamiliar to me. Why in the world, when someone is there to get advice, would you ask them if they'd like some advice? And that, it may shock and amaze some of you like it did me. Well, probably not most of you. But when I first found out that people didn't want unsolicited advice, I was just gobsmacked. You got to be kidding me. Who wouldn't want good advice? Now, there's quotes around good, because my interpretation of what is good advice and what another person's interpretation is good advice can be worlds apart. So I think that the the first step is to ask them if they're open to some feedback. Now, not every person that says, yes, I'm open to feedback is really open to feedback. Every once in a while, you'll get somebody who's really in touch with them that will say no, or not at this time. I just need to talk more about this. So it's really hard to give advice when advice isn't wanted. And that's good to know, of course, if you're the advice giver. And one of the reasons that if advice isn't wanted, it can be because no one likes being told what to do. Or they may not be in a position to really want advice at that time, especially if they haven't asked for it. The best time to give advice is when someone says, I would like your advice on this. Or what would you do in this situation? Or what would you do if you were me? That is typically golden. It still doesn't mean that they're ready to hear completely. But that's the best way to know it could be time to give some advice. And even in those cases, I can get reluctant to give advice because it can be ill received even if a person asks for it. So timing and wording is everything. Another issue is that the advice may not be relevant to that person's situation. And this happens when we get advice before we feel hurt. Or as a professional, you give advice before you've got all the information about the situation. Or you're not really seeing it through the person's perspective. Now, this is a big resistance, right? And that's when you give that type of advice, you'll immediately get resistance. Maybe the person will be kind enough to give you some more information, but maybe they shut down. Maybe they change the subject. Maybe they just go on. It is up to the professional to know that something just didn't land, that the advice did not land. And so asking if I can give the advice, and then giving the advice, and there's immediate resistance, I may not have the full picture. Now, I can be guilty of this a lot because I can operate under assumption. And a person can say a few sentences, and immediately I make the assumption I understand what they're talking about, and I understand what the solution would be. And if I were to hold on for a few paragraphs more or ask clarifying questions, do things as simple as say, tell me more about that, I often find out that what I thought was the obvious solution a few minutes ago was not. So the same thing can happen to you when someone gives advice and nope, they don't see the whole picture. That's resistance. So those are some of the things that come up. And another one is that the advice isn't given in a gentle or helpful way. Sometimes advice can be given very judgmental or very condescending, where a person probably is not going to be accepting of that, even if it's right. I can think of an encounter that one of my family members recently had with a physician, and his advice was judgmental, condescending, rude, abrupt. I mean, I almost tick off all the boxes. And obviously it didn't land well, and it didn't end up in that person changing. And actually built animosity in that relationship. So these are some of the things why advice may not be taken. And again, another one that I'm just thinking of is sometimes with advice, our freedom feels really threatened, right? We can almost feel like we want to do the opposite of what this person just told us to do, even if the advice was well-intentioned. So this is a life skill. This is a semester in college in learning how to identify resistance and give advice in a manner that is going to be received. And I sometimes try to tick some of these boxes when asked for advice, saying, well, I've heard a little bit about your situation. I don't know it all. From everything I know, and if it were me, these are a couple things I would consider. And on my good days, I try to give options, not just one thing. Well, I would do X. There are typically 3 courses of action that anybody can take. And even laying the options out rather than giving the advice, this is what you should do, which is a killer word, should, or ought to do, is to give it some options. I see several options that you have. One is to do nothing. That can really take resistance off the table. Another is you could do this, or I've had some people do this. In other situations, I've had some clients do that. And when presented with options, a person's much more receptive to thinking about that, to being open to those options. Unfortunately, the thing that often is done, I know with advice givers, especially financial planners, is they double down and become more direct and confrontive. Almost like, didn't you hear me? I am the expert here. You need to do what I say. You're here paying me. And financial planners can get very confrontive and themselves become threatened, and thinking that, well, maybe the advice that I gave wasn't good. Maybe there's something wrong with it. But typically when they double down, they're not in that place. So it can just escalate, or everybody's got their feet planted and nothing really happens. And we know, according to the research, that resistance leads to increased confrontational behaviors on the part of the person giving the advice. So it's a no-win situation for everybody. It just advice given at the wrong time can evoke defensiveness, whereby the person lists all the reasons that they're not going to change, and it really intensifies those reasons. Planners often end up labeling a client as difficult, and they can sometimes just give up that this client's not a fit and send them in search of another professional. And what's really happened in this case is the advisor has run out of tools. So when an advice giver recognizes resistance, and that means they're moving too fast, the next step is to stop. Stop pounding the nail. Back up and realize that the client isn't feeling heard, or the client is feeling threatened, or there are difficult emotions coming up in the advice that they just heard. Maybe it was the very thing they didn't want to hear. And there's fear, they're freezing, whatever that reaction could be. So you could say that client resistance is a sign that the advice giver needs to do a better job of listening rather than telling. And I would suggest for any advisor that listening is the biggest part of the job. Because typically when a client really feels heard, really feels listened to, they will ask for advice if they haven't already solved the problem themselves. I can't tell you how many times I've just employed some really good listening skills, and the person actually comes up with the solution for them and thanks me for the advice. Or they'll come up to me, maybe months later and say, the advice that you gave me in that session was so good. And I didn't give them any advice. In fact, I feel a little shame or guilt. No. I did not give you advice. I should also say that there's no shame in feeling resistance to advice. In Facilitating Financial Health, we wrote that the subconscious brain hasn't received a programming update in 100,000 years and is wired to resist change. So it is wired to overestimate the value of the status quo, which is status quo bias, and underestimate the value of change. It's similar to loss aversion. We are way more adverse to an equal loss than we are positively viewing an equal gain. So this is just how we are wired. And so when we resist, it's often because we're attempting to avoid some difficult feelings or avoid recalling a painful event. In IFS speak, what's happening is that a manager is stepping in saying, nope, we're not going to do that, or this is why we're not going to do that. Oh, what's going on? That manager is protecting a part that's been exiled, that maybe had something similar happen in the past, or is really fearful about what that means to do that, and is starting to emote, so to speak, and the manager stepping in and saying, we're shutting this down. We're not going to go there. So as the advisor, we need to stop, hang out, and be present with the client. Now, as a client, you're going to work with advisors that are going to start giving information. You're going to recognize that you're feeling resistance, and they can be oblivious to that fact. So when you see that resistance within yourself, it's a sign that that professional is moving too fast and that you're not feeling heard or you're feeling scared. Something's going on. So a thing to do, and there's many responses, but you could just gently ask the advisor to stop. Let them know, wow, I'm feeling resistance. And you don't even need to necessarily say why at that moment. If you can catch it quick enough, just, I'm feeling resistance, and kind of in a curiosity way. I am curious. What is this resistance about? It might even be advice you've gotten before. It might be advice that makes perfect sense to you. But to have a relationship with that advisor, to build one, just saying, it all makes sense, and yet I feel this resistance. So let them know that you're aware of that, and that what you think it might be, that there's more, it's bringing up something in the past, but you can ask them to stop trying to convince you of a solution and help you process your resistance. And I want to underscore again, you don't need to know why you're feeling resistance. It's just enough to know that you are feeling the resistance. If the advisor isn't emotionally available to understand your need to process or how to hang out with you and process, you might need to put a bookmark in the discussion until you can explore the resistance with yourself, a friend, or a financial therapist or a therapist. So the bottom line for both an advice giver and a client is to be sensitive to what is coming up, to be aware of resistance that comes up and not gloss it over. You can gloss it over within yourself. Yeah, I feel that resistance, but I know what's being said is right. I know I've got to buckle up and do it. Well, how many times has that not worked in the past? Ignoring it isn't going to get us anywhere. We've got to stop and pay some attention to that resistance. So, when you're feeling resistance in yourself or someone else, it's a sign someone in the conversation is moving too fast. And it's time to slow down, back up, and hang out in order to make progress. Thanks for joining me. I look forward to talking to you next week.